Karoline Leavitt stepped into her old high school gym, the glitz of the alumni fundraiser clashing with the faded memories of her teenage years. Down the hall, an 80-year-old janitor, Harold Grayson, mopped the floors in quiet obscurity until a group of wealthy ex-classmates sneered at him, their entitlement dripping like venom. What happened next would turn the entire town upside down and rewrite one man's legacy in a way no one saw coming. Before we jump into this wild ride, drop a comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. If you're hooked on stories that hit you right in the feels, smash that subscribe button, because tomorrow we've got another jaw-dropping tale waiting for you. Karoline Leavitt walked into the auditorium of her old high school in New Hampshire, her heels clicking against the polished tile. At 28, she was no longer the wide-eyed girl who'd raced through these halls, dreaming of bigger things. Now she was a rising political star, once a press assistant to Donald Trump, a congressional candidate in 2022, a name people recognized. She'd come back for an alumni fundraiser, a glitzy affair meant to bankroll new tech and shiny upgrades for the school. But ambition wasn't what tugged at her tonight. It was something else, something heavier, a smoky haze of memory that hit her the moment she stepped inside. Not the speeches or the donation pledges, but him. Down the hall, Harold Grayson pushed a mop bucket, his gray uniform hanging loose on his frail frame. 80 years old, hunched and slow, he was still here, still mopping, still dragging that same bucket she'd seen a decade ago. Karoline froze, her breath catching. She'd assumed he'd retired years back, feet up somewhere quiet, maybe with a pension and a porch. Not this. Not still scrubbing floors like time had forgotten him. The sight twisted something in her gut. He'd been a fixture back then, a quiet shadow slipping through her teenage chaos. She'd waved at him once or twice, maybe said thanks when he'd swept up a mess she'd left behind. But she'd never really seen him. Not like this. The fundraiser buzzed behind her, laughter, clinking glasses, old classmates swapping stories of their glory days. Karoline barely heard it, her eyes locked on Harold as he wrung out the mop, his hands trembling slightly. Still mopping, still pushing, still here. She'd built a career on spotting injustice, on calling it out, but this felt personal. Why was an 80-year-old man still working? Was it choice, need, or worse, had someone forced him to stay? The thought gnawed at her, sharp and insistent. She'd spent her youth chasing dreams, while he'd spent his life keeping this place clean, and she'd never noticed. Her mind flashed back to those high school years, endless ambition, late nights, plotting her future. She'd been loud, determined, the girl who'd talk anyone's ear off about changing the world. Harold had been there too, humming softly as he worked, unnoticed by kids too wrapped up in themselves. She remembered the faint chemical tang in the air back then, like a smoky veil of memory that clung to every corner. It was still there now, sharper somehow, pulling her back. She'd moved on, DC campaigns, headlines, while he'd stayed. Trapped, maybe. The guilt hit hard. Had she ever thanked him? Had anyone? Karoline took a step closer, her polished exterior cracking. Harold didn't look up, just kept mopping, his movements deliberate but unsteady. His face was a map of deep lines, each one a silent story of years piled on years. She wanted to ask, needed to know, why he was still here. Was it pride, poverty? Had the system failed him, like it failed so many? She'd heard the stories, pensions too thin to live on, social security that didn't stretch far enough, but seeing it in front of her, in him, made it real, too real. A trio of alumni brushed past her, their suits crisp and voices loud. They didn't glance at Harold, didn't pause to wonder why an old man was still hunched over a mop. To them, he was invisible, just part of the building, like the lockers or the scuffed desks. Karoline's jaw tightened. She'd been one of them once, too busy to care. But not now. Not when she could still hear the echo of his quiet presence in her memories, a steady hum beneath the noise of her teenage years. He'd been there, still mopping, still pushing, still here, while she'd run off to chase her spotlight. She crossed her arms, wrestling with the unease bubbling inside. What if he didn't want to be here? What if he'd been forced to keep going, too stubborn or too broke to stop? The thought stung deeper than she expected. She'd built her life on fighting for what was right. Speeches, debates, promises to fix things. Yet here was Harold Grayson, a living reminder of everything she'd overlooked. Her chest tightened with something she couldn't name. Anger, maybe? Or shame. She'd ignored him back then, taken him for granted, and now, seeing him still tethered to that mop, she couldn't shake the suspicion that he was paying a price for a world that didn't care. Karoline straightened, her resolve hardening. She wasn't here to wallow in nostalgia or sip wine with old classmates. Not anymore. Harold Grayson deserved more than this. More than a bucket and a paycheck that barely kept the lights on. She didn't know the whole story yet, but she'd find out. She had to. Because if there was one thing Karoline Leavitt knew how to do, it was dig in and fight. And this was a fight she hadn't seen coming. One she couldn't walk away from. Karoline Leavitt couldn't just stand there, watching Harold Grayson mop the floor like a ghost stuck in time. She took a deep breath and walked over, her voice cutting through the hum of the fundraiser down the hall. "Mr. Grayson," she said, softer than she'd meant to. He glanced up, his tired eyes narrowing for a split second, before recognition flickered in them. A faint smile tugged at his weathered lips. "Well, I'll be Karoline Leavitt," he rasped, his voice gravelly but warm. "You've gone and made something of yourself, haven't you?" She forced a smile, but it didn't sit right, not with the question burning in her chest. "It's been a while," she said, stepping closer. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Still working?" Harold nodded, leaning on the mop handle like it was holding him up. "Somebody's got to keep this place clean," he said, simple as that. But it wasn't simple, not to her. She tilted her head, searching his face. "I figured you'd be retired by now. Relaxing somewhere, you know?" He chuckled, a dry sound that carried no joy. "Retirement's not for everyone, kid." Karoline crossed her arms, her instincts kicking in. She'd spent years sniffing out half-truths on campaign trails in press rooms. This felt like one. "Or not an option for everyone?" she pressed. Harold's step hitched, just for a moment, but he shook it off and kept mopping. "You always were too sharp," he muttered, wiping the handle with a rag. She wasn't letting it go. "Why are you still here, Mr. Grayson? Really?" He sighed, the sound heavy, and finally met her gaze. "It's not what you think. No one's chaining me to this mop. I stay because I choose to." She frowned. "Choose to? At 80? He shrugged, his shoulders stiff. "Worked since I was a boy. This job's steady. Took care of my family, kept the bills paid. Pension's thin, barely covers the roof over my head, so I stay." His words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper into her. A pension too thin to live on. She'd heard the stats, fought the debates, but hearing it from him, seeing it, made her stomach twist. "You shouldn't have to," she said, quieter now. "Not after all these years." Harold's jaw tightened, and he turned back to the bucket. "I don't need pity, Karoline. I've got my pride, always have." She opened her mouth to argue, but the clatter of footsteps interrupted her. 3 men in tailored suits strode down the hall, their voices loud, their Rolexes glinting. Alumni, probably her age or older, dripping with the kind of wealth that screamed success. They barely glanced at Harold, until one of them, a broad-shouldered guy with slicked-back hair, smirked. "Still at it, huh, old man?" he said, loud enough to carry. "Guess some people never climb out of the basement." The others laughed, sharp and cruel, the sound slicing into the air like a knife. Harold didn't flinch, just kept mopping, but Karoline's blood boiled. She stepped forward, her voice low and edged. "Excuse me?" The slick-haired guy turned, sizing her up with a grin. "Oh, look, it's the politician. What's this, your next photo op, saving the janitor?" His buddies snickered, and the contrast hit her hard. Their polished arrogance against Harold's quiet struggle. Rich versus poor, loud versus silent, careless versus burdened. She clenched her fists. "He's worth 10 of you," she snapped. "Maybe if you'd ever worked a real day, you'd get it." The guy's grin vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Oh, please. Don't play saint with me, Leavitt. We all know your game." Trump's little mouthpiece turned bleeding heart. "Hypocrite much?" The words stung, dragging up her past. Every headline, every attack ad from her 2022 campaign. She'd taken heat for her politics, her loyalty, her ambition. But this wasn't about her. "This isn't a game," she shot back. "He's 80, still breaking his back because the system screwed him. Where's your compassion?" "Compassion?" Another one chimed in, his tie loosened like he owned the place. He's a janitor. If he's still here, that's on him, not my problem. The third guy nodded, tossing out, yeah, maybe he likes it. Some people are just built for the bottom. Their laughter cut again, jagged and cold, and Karoline's vision blurred with rage. She stepped closer, voice trembling but firm. You think it's funny? He kept this school running while you were busy flunking gym. Show some damn respect. Slick hair squared up, his face darkening. Respect? Coming from you? Miss Locker-Up cheerleader? Spare me the lecture. Her past crashed into her present, a cheap shot she should have seen coming. She'd fought those battles, defended her choices, taken the hits, but hearing it now, weaponized against Harold, lit a fire she couldn't tamp down. Say what you want about me, she hissed, but don't you dare talk down to him. He's not your punching bag. Harold's voice broke through, quiet but firm. Enough, Karoline. She turned, startled. He'd stopped mopping, his hands steady now, eyes hard. I don't need you fighting my battles. I've handled worse than a few loudmouths. His pride stood tall, unshaken, but it only fueled her anger. She wanted to scream at him, at them, at the whole rotten setup. You shouldn't have to handle anything, she said, her voice cracking. Not anymore. The men walked off, their laughter fading into the gym's noise, leaving a bitter silence. Harold went back to his mop, shutting her out. She stood there, chest heaving, caught between fury and guilt. They'd mocked him and she'd snapped. But had she made it worse? Her past clung to her like a shadow, twisting her intentions. She'd come to help, but now she wondered if she'd just turned him into a spectacle. Harold didn't want her pity, didn't want her fight, and that hurt more than the insults. Karoline Leavitt wasn't the type to back down. Harold Grayson's words, his stubborn refusal to let her fight, only stoked the fire in her gut. She couldn't just walk away, not when he was still mopping floors at 80 because the world had dealt him a raw deal. By the time the fundraiser's chatter faded behind her, she'd get him out of this, whether he liked it or not. Her phone was out before she hit the parking lot, fingers flying as she dialed Tom Wheeler, an old classmate who'd turned number crunching into a six-figure career. He picked up, voice groggy. Karoline, what's this about? No small talk, Tom, she said, pacing. I need your help. There's a guy here, Harold Grayson, the janitor from school. He's 80, still working because his pension's a joke. I want to set up a fundraiser. Pay off his debts, get him enough to retire. You in? Silence stretched, then a low whistle. That's big, Tom said. You're talking real money. I'll run the numbers, see what we need, but you sure he'll take it? She gritted her teeth. He won't have a choice, Tom chuckled. Still bulldozing your way through life, huh? I'm in. One down. Next, she called Susan Carter, the new principal, a woman she'd never met, but whose name carried weight in town. Susan answered with a clipped yes. Karoline laid it out fast, Harold's story, the fundraiser, the plan to rally the community. She expected enthusiasm, or at least a nod. Instead, Susan's voice turned icy. Let me stop you there, Ms. Leavitt. Harold Grayson's just a janitor. He's not some cause worth headlines, and frankly, I don't need this school tied to your project. Karoline blinked, caught off guard. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Susan snapped, we've got an image to maintain, new tech, top scores, that's what donors care about, not an old man who's too stubborn to quit. He's not worth the attention. The words landed like a slap. Not worth it. Karoline's grip tightened on the phone. He kept this place running for decades, she shot back. You're telling me that's nothing? Susan didn't budge. I'm telling you it's not my problem, or the school's. Do what you want, but leave our name out of it. Karoline hung up, fuming. Susan's dismissal wasn't just cold, it was blind. But she didn't need permission. She'd go bigger. Social media, local news, old classmates. She was drafting a pitch in her head when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered, wary. Karoline Leavitt? The voice was smooth, sharp, like a blade waiting to cut. This is James Norton. Heard you're stirring up trouble over that janitor. Her stomach dropped. Norton, big shot alum, real estate mogul, the kind of guy who'd sue over a parking spot. It's not trouble, she said. It's a fundraiser. For Harold Grayson. James laughed, dry and mean. Yeah, I heard. And I hear you're planning to drag the school's name into it. Don't. I've got lawyers on speed dial and I'll bury you if you try. This isn't your little DC circus. His threat hung there, sharp as a sword dangling overhead. Karoline's pulse raced. "You'd sue over helping an old man?" she asked, incredulous. "Over protecting what's mine," he corrected. "You think you can waltz in, play savior, and use my alma mater for clout? I know your type. Trump's pit bull, all bark and no bite. Back off, or I'll make it ugly." Her past flared up again, a cheap jab she couldn't dodge. "This isn't about me," she said, voice shaking with anger. "It's about a guy who's worked his whole life and got nothing for it. You'd rather flex your power than lift a finger?" James didn't flinch. "Cry me a river. He's not my charity case. And you're not fooling anyone with this bleeding heart act. Everyone knows your record. Keep the school out of it or you'll regret it." He hung up, leaving her seething. James Norton wasn't just a bully. He was a wall she'd have to smash through. She didn't have time to cool off. She tracked Harold down the next day, back in the same hallway, still mopping like nothing had changed. He glanced up, frowning. "You again?" She didn't waste time. "I'm starting a fundraiser for you," she said flat out. "To get you out of here. You deserve to rest." His face darkened instantly. "What did I tell you about pity?" he growled, slamming the mop against the bucket. "I heard about your little plan, people talking, saying you're making me some sob story. I ain't no clown for your show, Karoline." She stepped back, stunned. "It's not like that," she insisted. "I'm trying to help." "Help?" he cut in, voice rising. "You think I want the whole town gawking at me, laughing at the old fool who can't quit? I don't need it. Don't want it. Don't deserve it." The words hit like a drumbeat. Not worthy, not needed, not wanted. She stared at him, chest tight. "You're wrong," she said. "You've earned this 100 times over." He shook his head, furious. "You don't get to decide that. I'm not your cause." The air crackled between them. She'd expected pushback, but not this, not rage. "I'm doing this because it's right," she said, voice steady despite the heat in her throat. "Not for me, for you." Harold turned away, gripping the mop like a lifeline. "Then you're wasting your time," he muttered. "Leave me be." He went back to work, shutting her out, but the sting of his rejection burned. Susan didn't care. James was ready to sue. Harold hated the idea. And still, Karoline couldn't stop. She'd fight them all if she had to, because giving up wasn't in her blood. Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch, not at Susan Carter's cold dismissal, not at James Norton's legal threats, not even at Harold Grayson's stubborn anger. She'd faced worse. Heckled crowds, smear campaigns, the relentless grind of politics. This was a fight she could win. She hit the ground running, fingers blazing across her phone as she posted to X, Instagram, anywhere people would see it. Harold Grayson, 80, still mopping our old high school floors because his pension isn't enough. Let's give him the retirement he deserves, link in bio. She tagged alumni, local reporters, anyone with a pulse and a conscience. By morning, the fundraiser was live, and she'd called every news outlet in New Hampshire. The response was electric. Donations poured in, $5, $20, $100 at a time. Old classmates shared stories. "Mr. Grayson fixed my locker when it jammed before a big test. He stayed late so I wouldn't wait alone after practice." The total climbed past $10,000 in hours, then $25,000 by nightfall. Karoline watched the numbers soar, a grim smile tugging at her lip. She'd done it, forced the world to see what she saw. By the third day, it hit $75,000, and the local paper ran a front-page story, "Community Rallies for Unsung Hero." Messages flooded in, gratitude, tears, promises to do more. She'd cracked the town open, and Harold's name was on everyone's lips. She found him in the hallway again, mop in hand, oblivious to the storm she'd unleashed. "Mr. Grayson," she said, voice steady but buzzing with triumph. "We did it. $75,000. You're free." He froze, his knuckles whitening around the handle. "What are you talking about?" She held up her phone, the fundraiser page glowing. "The town pitched in. You don't have to work anymore. It's yours." His eyes flicked to the screen, then back to her, darkening. "I told you," he said, low and tight. "I don't want your charity." Karoline blinked, thrown off. "It's not charity. It's what you've earned." He shook his head, stepping back like the money was poison. "You don't listen, do you? I've been saving every dime I've made here, not for some cushy retirement, For a library, a little one, right here in this school. Been my plan for years. His voice cracked, raw with something she hadn't heard before. I don't need your pity, Cash. I've got my own dream. The words slammed into her, heavy as a stone. A library? She stared, mouth dry, the fundraiser's triumph crumbling in her hands. You're serious? She managed. Harold's glare sharpened. Dead serious. And now you've gone and turned me into your puppet, a sad old man for folks to feel sorry for. I never asked for that. The accusation stung, sharp and deep. Karoline's chest tightened, the money she'd raised suddenly a burden pressing down on Harold's shoulders instead of a lifeline. I wasn't trying to make you a puppet, she shot back, heat rising. I was trying to help. You're too damn stubborn to see it. Stubborn? He barked, louder now. You're the one shoving this down my throat. I've lived my life my way, worked hard, saved up, kept my head down. You think you can swoop in and fix me? I ain't broken. His voice echoed off the walls and Karoline flinched, but she didn't back down. You're not broken, but you're blind, she snapped. People care about you, want to give you something back. Why's that so hard to take? Harold's face twisted, fury and pride warring in his eyes. Because it's not their place, or yours. Before she could fire back, her phone buzzed. A notification from X. She glanced at it and her stomach dropped. James Norton had posted, Leavitt's fundraiser is a scam, using Grayson to boost her own image. Don't fall for it, comments exploded, half defending her, half tearing her apart. Typical politician. She's legit. I donated. Grayson doesn't even want it. Check the facts. The town split down the middle, and Karoline's jaw clenched. Norton wasn't just threatening now. He was poisoning the well. She looked up at Harold, who'd gone quiet, watching her. You see this? She said, holding up the post. Norton's spreading lies, saying I'm using you. I'm fighting for you, and this is what I get. Harold's expression didn't soften. Maybe he's half right, he muttered. You didn't ask me what I wanted, you decided. The words cut deeper than Norton's smear, a jagged edge of truth she couldn't dodge. She'd pushed too hard, assumed too much. The fundraiser, her victory, felt hollow now, a weight neither of them wanted. You really don't get it, she said, voice shaking. I saw you stuck here and thought I could change it. Was that so wrong? Harold exhaled, slow and heavy. Not wrong, just not yours to fix. He turned back to his mop, dismissing her, but the rift between them pulsed like a live wire. Karoline stood there, reeling. $75,000 raised, a community divided, and Harold rejecting it all for a dream she'd never seen coming. Norton's lies were spreading, and her good intentions were unraveling. She'd wanted to lift him up, but the gap between his pride and her help yawned wider than ever. Karoline Leavitt let it go. The fundraiser, the fight, the $75,000? She shut it down. Harold Grayson's words had carved a hole in her resolve, and James Norton's lies had turned her victory into quicksand. She posted one last update online. Fundraiser's off. Respecting Harold's wishes. Thanks for caring. The comments split. Some praised her, others jeered, but she didn't read them. He'd pushed too hard, assumed too much, and the sting of it lingered. She packed up, ready to leave New Hampshire behind, figuring Harold would mop those floors until the end, just like he wanted. She was done trying to save him. But the story didn't end there. A week later, her phone buzzed with a text from Tom Wheeler. You need to see this. Attached was a photo, a small, freshly built library in the school's west wing. Shelves gleaming with new books. A sign above the door read, Harold Grayson Reading Room. Karoline stared, heart thudding. Tom explained. A group of current students had overheard her clash with Harold, dug into his dream of a library and taken it on themselves. They'd raised the money, bake sales, car washes, a GoFundMe, finished it in days, and named it for him. No one had told her. No one had told Harold either, not until it was done. She drove back, pulling into the school lot just as a crowd gathered for the unveiling. Kids beamed, teachers clapped, and Harold stood there, mop forgotten, staring at the sign with wet eyes. He didn't speak, just nodded, lips pressed tight. But Karoline saw the crack in his armor. The students had done what she couldn't, honored him without forcing it. She hung back, watching, a lump rising in her throat. The library stood there like his soul-given form. a quiet testament to a man who'd never asked for anything. She thought that was it, the end she'd never expected. She was wrong. 2 days later, Tom called again, voice heavy. "Harold's gone, Karoline. Heart attack last night. Found him in the hallway, mop in hand." The words hit like a punch. She sank into a chair, breath gone. "He was working?" she whispered. Tom sighed. "Yeah." Never stopped. No one saw it coming. No one expected. No one knew, no one guessed. Harold hadn't retired, hadn't rested. He'd chosen the work, the floors, until his last beat, but there was more. Tom mailed her a letter found in Harold's locker, scribbled in shaky ink. She tore it open, hands trembling. "Karoline didn't want your money, but you woke this town up. They saw me because of you. That library's more than I ever dreamed. Don't feel bad. I went out my way. Thanks, kid." Her eyes blurred with tears. Harold hadn't hated her. He'd seen what she'd done, even if he couldn't take it for himself. The library, his death, that note, it twisted everything she'd thought she'd failed at. He'd died working, not resting, leaving a legacy she hadn't meant to build. She sat there, letter in hand, replaying every fight, every push. Had she pushed him too far? Or just far enough? The unveiling went on without him. Kids cut the ribbon, parents snapped photos, and the Harold Grayson reading room opened its doors. Karoline stood in the back, quiet, the weight of it settling in. She'd wanted to give him freedom, but he'd chosen his own end. Mop in hand, pride intact. The library was his, not hers, a gift from kids who'd seen what she'd missed. And that letter, it shifted something in her. Loneliness didn't need acceptance to matter. She'd stirred the pot, and even if Harold never took her help, it had rippled out anyway. She drove home, the road blurring through tears. No one expected him to go like that. No one knew he'd leave that note. No one guessed the mark he'd leave. Harold's death wasn't her triumph or her failure. It was his. And maybe, she thought, that was the point. Kindness could plant a seed, even if it grew in ways you'd never see coming. Karoline learned that kindness doesn't need permission to matter. It's a spark that can light up lives, even if it burns differently than planned. Harold's story teaches us to notice the quiet ones, to act before it's too late, because impact outlives intent. In life, we can plant seeds of good without forcing the harvest. Sometimes, it's enough to start the ripple. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Drop a comment. How would you honor someone like Harold? Hit subscribe for more stories that hit home, and share this if it moved you. See you next time.